So many of the people in your books leave a really strong impression. You think about them even years later. The one I wrote down was Chris Langan, the world's the smartest person in the world who had a life that you would not think. Who stays in your mind of the people you've written about like that? Who are the characters that you kind of think about still?
In David and Goliath, the guy, Emil Freireich, the cancer researcher I wrote about.
Oh, yeah.
Who I really, I feel like it's one of those instances. Remember when I said I thought that writing is about listening and empathy? I called him, I knew about him because I was doing another story entirely, and I called him for just some small thing. And he's like, so for those of you who haven't read the book, this is this guy who is essentially, there's a group of people, but he's the lead guy in the group that cures childhood leukemia, and basically creates the paradigm for the successful treatment of a number of cancers through chemotherapy. Does this all at NIH in the NCI in the late 60s, early 70s. So he's like in his 80s. I call him up on the story, and I thought he was the most obnoxious person I'd ever talked to in my life. And it was one of those things where I didn't want to talk to him. I wanted to get off the phone as quickly as possible. He just was like being sort of hateful and weird and blah, blah, blah. And then I hung up, and then I thought, well, there was a reason I called him, because he's supposed to be an expert, so I'll look again and see what he did. And I sort of began to read about him, and I realized that I wanted to go and see him again and talk to him in more detail about what he had done, because I was sort of curious. And I went down to Houston to see him, and the same thing happened. The first hour was incredibly difficult. And then I began to realize that the thing that made his research possible and his obnoxious personality were the same. That you couldn't separate his genius from his... So when I understood that in the years when he was putting forth this idea of... Basically, he was the guy behind combination chemotherapy. You take the kid who's this big and is dying, has 3 weeks to live, and everyone else has given up on and has a 100% mortality rate, and is living in a ward in a hospital and bleeding uncontrollably from every orifice, such that there is blood on the walls and on the ceiling, and the nurses come out at the end of the night and their whole uniforms are red. Wow. And the doctors won't go in because it's so depressing. That's the scene. And everyone has given up on these children. And here's a guy who decides at the age of 27 or 28 that he is going to do what everyone else thinks is impossible, which is solve this disease. And he sets out a strategy that is so bizarre and out of the ordinary that everyone in his entire world denounces him, tries to drive him out of NCI, heckles him at meetings, calls him a Nazi doctor. I mean, he puts up with the most unspeakable level of... And all the while he is going into these wards every day, and no one will help him, and he's conducting medical trials by himself on these kids, right? And how do you do that? You do that if you are someone who is like that, indomitable. Yeah. You know your own, you could care less what anyone thinks about you. You say what's on your mind. You never worry for a moment that you're going to offend someone. That's just who we, and you can't have one without the other, right?
Yeah.
And until I realized that until I understood that, I had, what had I done? It was a moral failing on my part, right? I had judged him way too prematurely, and I also, I had failed at my task as a writer and as a human being to understand him, right? And that's like, it made me realize you can't, I feel the whole process of my writing career has been an exercise in delaying the moment at which I draw a conclusion about something.
That's interesting.
And that was another, there's a series of sort of milestones in that, but that was one where I'm ashamed of how I thought about him in the beginning.